right. Hello to everyone, and thank you for attending this live webinar organized by the InfoCredit Professional Education Division. My name is Panagiotis Marino, and I'm the head of the training department. Today we have with us Mr. Simon Osborne, who will talk about the governance and the impact of COVID-19. Simon is a training and board evaluation and governance consultant. He stepped down as CEO of ICSA, the Chartered Governance Institute, on 30th of June 2019, having held the role since 1st of October 2011. That appointment followed 8 years as joint head of ICSA ICSA Board Evaluation, a role to which he has returned. Simon is a fellow of the CGI. He worked as in-house legal counsel for 30 years in the railway industry, latterly as company secretary and general counsel, and then as a main board executive director of the former Railtrack Group plc. Simon is now an executive fellow with the London Business School Leadership Institute. In addition to his board evaluation practice, he delivers training programs for company directors. Before the presentation starts, some important administrative notes about the webinar. All participants are in a mute mode. You could submit questions via meeting chat box. Questions will be answered during the Q&A session. The instructor will answer privately any question not addressed during this session. The video of the presentation will be publicly available on the InfoCredit Group's website and on our company's social media channels. The certificate of attendance will be sent to your email address. In case you are experiencing any kind of technical issues during this webinar, please email at info@ip.com. All right, now the session will start. Mr. Osborne, please, the stage is yours.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and greetings from London. We're living in unusual times, and I'm sure that the current lockdown is troubling you in Cyprus as much as it is us here in the UK. And I think it's fair to say that in a crisis like COVID-19, as it says on the slide, stakes are high, scrutiny is intense. And for company directors and company officers, stepping in to resolve issues may be uncomfortable, but stepping aside is not an option. I come back to a point you've probably heard, some of you may have heard me say before, that when it comes to the non-executive directors, they have to be supportive. They've got to let management manage the business. It's a case of noses in, fingers out. But in the unusual circumstances of COVID-19, if, for example, the chief executive succumbs to this virus, and it is disabling, I speak from experience because I've had it and my wife has had it. We've both now fully recovered. But this is severe enough, this virus, to create succession risks, and that's something not to be overlooked. And the other point to bear in mind is that at some point we will emerge from this crisis, and when we do, there are going to have to be inquiries, there are going to have to be reviews about how individual businesses managed. Effectively, a post-mortem is needed in order to improve future resilience. So let's just, with that, following those introductory remarks, this is what we're going to cover. Just a few points about holding board meetings and board committee meetings. Companies have still to continue operating, and the decision-making organs need to be able to meet legally and effectively. I'm going to spend just a brief moment on annual general meetings because local law will obviously be different to what we're used to here in the UK. I'm going to spend a bit longer on trust and reputation. Then finally, in the fourth section, some closing reminders, points which need to be borne in mind at all times, but particularly now. So let's just focus first on this point about good practice for virtual board and committee meetings. First up, this whole question of constitutional issues. When there are restrictions on numbers of people who can meet together, where physical distancing is required, holding a conventional board meeting or a meeting of the committee of a board becomes much more challenging. So does your company's legislation permit meetings by telephone conference call or video conferencing? Even if a legal provision in your company's law is not required, what about the company's constitution? Is provision made for telephone or video conferencing as a means by which a valid meeting of the board of directors or a committee of directors can be held? And while we're on this subject, the question of location becomes important because companies will choose a domicile very often for tax reasons. And if you've got your directors in the wrong place, or if the company's constitution specifies where a meeting is being held, and if that is related in any way to the physical presence of members of the board, or particularly the chair of the board, then major tax implications could arise. There could be jurisdiction implications as well. So we should always think tax anyway. Tax looms large these days. A lot of companies, of course, go to wholly ridiculous lengths to save tax and end up spending so much more on advisors that you wonder why they made the effort in the first place. But there are major taxation downsides if you don't think about the tax implications of where you're meeting. I've given you there a reference to an interesting document about corporate residence in the light of COVID-19. It's produced by a City of London law firm, McFarlane's. And while obviously it is related to the position in the UK, it may provide some helpful pointers if tax and tax jurisdiction issues arise for any of you in the audience or anyone else who's not listening in, but who you know might need to be aware of that. If you're going to have a virtual board meeting, then you've got to make sure you've got the right technology. And the choice of the right channel is vital, because if the technology doesn't work, your meeting is going to be harder to run. It may go on for longer than is optimal. It'll certainly be less effective, not least because you're dealing with people. Human beings can get irritated. And if the technology isn't working and you've got grumpy directors, they're unlikely to be participating in the most effective board meetings. Decision making is challenging at the best of times. Decision making when the chosen medium for communication is faulty or less than optimal is asking for possible trouble. Now, in that regard, an audio call or just a telephone conference call will be less risky. A video conference has the advantage of being more engaging, provided it works well. Being able to assess body language, being able to look colleagues in the eye, even over a distance of thousands of miles, has its advantages. Just one point to bear in mind, though, that if companies are using a board portal, like Diligent Board Books, for example, to distribute board packs, then the participants may need more than one screen. So you just need to bear that in mind. This may be a case where economy with the use of paper needs to be overlooked, and hard copy board packs may need to be provided so that directors at a board meeting aren't trying to switch between the video conference and their virtual board pack. Now, I'm going to take you to the last bullet point on this slide, first of all. If you fail to prepare properly, you could be preparing to fail. So while any meeting, particularly a board meeting or a board committee meeting, has got to be well structured and needs to avoid unnecessary complexity, that is increasingly important in the case of a virtual meeting. Don't overlook the constraints of technology. And we'll come back to this point. You may need to think about whether there are alternative ways of making essential board decisions. But whatever you do, good preparation, absolutely essential. You cannot just conjure up a meeting out of the blue without thinking about all the implications of how it's going to work, how everyone's going to participate, and think too about the outcomes you're trying to achieve. Are you, for example, holding a virtual board meeting by video conferencing because it seems like a nice thing to do when you could actually achieve the same result in a potentially less stressful way? Video conferencing is great, I'm not going to deny that, but may not always be the right way of going about holding a board meeting. Obviously, before the meeting, you need to think carefully about the agenda. Producing an agenda is an art, it's a skill. And in the case of a video conference board meeting, a shorter meeting is to be recommended. I think we're learning after certainly one. I'm personally in my seventh or eighth week of lockdown. We went into lockdown in the UK on the 23rd of March. But what we're learning, and I'm a fan of Zoom, what we're learning is Zoom fatigue can build up. So shorter meetings include breaks. Don't forget to take account of different time zones. The difference between the UK and Cyprus is easy to manage, 2 hours. It will be different if you have got a dispersed board further away from Cyprus, whether it be to the east or to the west. You only need someone in Hong Kong or in Australia or on the east or west coasts of the United States, and you can appreciate the challenge that arises. Very important to circulate the link and dial in details early. And people lose emails, and Panayotis will confirm. I'm quite good at losing dial in and linking details. So it's always good practice to circulate the details an hour before the meeting. Decide who's going to be the host of the meeting. My recommendation is the corporate secretary or the deputy corporate secretary should act as meeting host with all the details of access codes and pins. The joining instructions have got to be clear. Also, the importance of muting and unmuting the microphone, using the raise hand function. And then you've got the big debate too about whether or not to record proceedings. There can be an advantage in doing so. The only thing is, if you are going to record, how long are you going to keep the recording for? Rather like recording board meetings under more normal conditions than those we're experiencing, my strong and unequivocal advice will always be retain the recording no later than the day on which the board formally approves the minutes of its previous meeting. Once those minutes have been approved, most companies' constitutions will provide that those minutes are the definitive account of what was decided at the previous meeting. That is the point at which drafts of the minutes and any recording of the meeting should be deleted. Otherwise, if in the event of a dispute, you are leaving it open the possibility of an opponent, be it a dissident director, a dissident shareholder, a regulator who's after you. You're giving them ammunition with which to try to undermine what the record in the minutes actually says. So, to record or not record, to borrow from Hamlet, that is the question. But if you're going to record, don't hang on to recordings. They could be dangerous and have unintended consequences. I've made the point here for large meetings, it's important to consider the option of audio only. You know, if you're looking at a board meeting of more than 11, 12 directors, then you may be better off going to audio only. But whatever you're doing, make sure you've got the IT people on support on standby. And I think it's just worth making the point, this here at this juncture, that although we're trying to maintain business as usual in challenging circumstances, a lot of this is only made possible by the hard work of IT staff, who a lot of whom are having to go into work, are maybe working quite long hours, are, in addition to making sure that the systems work, are having to do a lot of on-the-spot instant training of people who are unfamiliar with the technology, may get grumpy, and when it comes to looking after staff, your IT staff are key workers, and they need to be appreciated. Saying thank you doesn't cost much, but it is well worth doing. Keep them on side. You hack off your IT people, don't be surprised if they leave you and get a job elsewhere. So, having waved the flag and banged the drum for IT support, let's move on. Now, during the meeting, how's the chair going to be supported? How are the chair and the corporate secretary going to communicate, particularly if they're not in the same building or even in the same country? My recommendation is to use WhatsApp. I know it's owned by the ghastly Facebook company. I have had to overcome my deeply held prejudices about Mr. Zuckerberg and all his works. A man who repeatedly sins and then with a rather sickly smile seeks forgiveness. But I think at least WhatsApp was developed by a different organization before it was taken over and seems to rely pretty well on end-to-end encryption. That's not to say that it can't be hacked, as 80 journalists in Israel discovered. I think it was in December, early December last year. But WhatsApp's probably the best way. Enough of my prejudices about Mr. Zuckerberg. The chairman will need to know who's in the meeting as board members, and any other employees or advisors who are in attendance. It's particularly important with a virtual board meeting to use a timed agenda so that everybody knows the point at which particular items are going to be reached. Obviously, that's a challenge for the chair to make sure that the meeting starts, each item starts pretty well on time or within 5 minutes either way. But it is important. The timed agenda is essential for every participant and everyone in attendance. Another point for those producing board papers or committee papers, the papers need to be very clear on the front page what the desired outcome is, what decision is being required. It's one thing to be a bit vague about that if it's a face-to-face board meeting with everyone sitting around a board table. But where you have a dispersed board, the desired outcome for each agenda item has got to be absolutely crystal clear. And once the decision's been taken, then the actions need to be clearly articulated and then recorded in the minutes. And the time frame for post-meeting follow-up needs to be clearly understood and recorded. Another important point is during the meeting is to make sure you've still got a quorum. The quorum for most boards, it will vary. Some want half the directors to be present, some want more. Whatever the quorum is for your organisation, you need to check at the start of the meeting you've got a quorum, and you need perhaps to check at the halfway point and at the end of the meeting. For example, when you get to any other business at the end of the agenda, just have a check, just make sure that your quorum hasn't evaporated for whatever reason. People giving up in despair, perhaps losing their internet connection, whatever. For those who are not able to join the meeting, it's important to brief them afterwards to avoid mushroom syndrome. Mushrooms thrive in darkness. Directors unable to make a meeting do not thrive if they're kept in the dark. I've already mentioned the importance of having a hard copy board pack if you're using a board portal, but if you don't resort to that and chop down a few more trees to produce that board pack, then at the very least, every book participant at the meeting needs a hard copy of the agenda so they can follow the meeting. Just a simple, straightforward point that's easily overlooked. The challenge for the chair is leading the meeting through the agenda. Chairmanship is challenging at the best of times. As I've said already, it will be even more so chairing a virtual board meeting. Going through the agenda, keeping to time, and making sure that discussion is relevant and not tangential. It's also a good idea to make sure directors speak in turn, so that rather than just inviting general comments on a point once the paper or subject has been presented, it's probably a better idea with a virtual meeting for the chair just to go round all the members of the board, work through the list that the chair's got in front of him or her, seek views, because that's the way to assure a more orderly discussion. And then I've said this already, and I'm going to repeat it, the clarity of decision making is absolutely vital. If you don't have the most united board, then there is scope there where you have a virtual board meeting for a director to say, I don't think that's what was agreed. I didn't hear that. So clarity of decision making is very important. And that's where the chair should really, at the end of the discussion, be summing up what has been decided and getting a clear indication from all the board members that they agree, to avoid a dissident director, should you have the misfortune to have one, making mischief. Okay, let's go on to our next subject, annual general meetings. I'm not going to spend long on this because the company law of Cyprus will be better known to some of you than it is to me. But we're now coming to AGM season. I don't know what the preference is in Cyprus, but if there is any similarity with the preference in the UK, most companies like to have a 31st December year end. The second favourite date is 31st March. So it's going to be very important in these situations where there is a limit on the number of people who can physically meet together to make sure that if your notice of AGM hasn't been given, to determine for how long you can hold off convening the meeting. If you've already given the notice of AGM, then one possibility is to convene the meeting and for the chair promptly to adjourn it for as long as possible. But whatever the decision is, check the company's constitution. Can the AGM be postponed? Can it be opened and adjourned? If it can be opened and adjourned, for how long? Can it be adjourned and can it be re-adjourned? Likewise, if notice of meeting has not been held, and most companies have a requirement in their constitution that an AGM must be held within so many months from year end, what is the legal position about postponing the AGM? Whatever you do, seek legal advice. Absolutely vital that you do so, because otherwise, if you have a shareholder who wants to make trouble, a difficult shareholder, there's nothing like a nice juicy procedural point like an AGM held out of time for that shareholder to start making trouble, including in the courts. So check with your lawyers, take legal advice. What's the quorum for holding a physical meeting? We've had some quite ingenious meetings have been held here. The surgical appliances company, Smith & Nephew, that makes, among other things, prosthetic limbs, At its AGM, they convened it, and the two shareholders who were physically present were the company secretary and her husband. The company secretary's husband was a former share registration expert. So they held the meeting on a piece of open ground to ensure they complied with legal requirements on physical distancing. They had a good internet connection where they were, and the meeting took place. The chair, who was not physically present, ran the meeting. Every resolution was decided on a poll, so there was no voting on a show of hands. Every resolution decided on a poll because the chairman exercised his power under the Articles of Association to call a poll on every resolution, and the meeting, as far as I know, went off extremely well. I think they were rather glad to be able this year to have that meeting in that way. One of the shareholders, Smith and Nephew, has some unfortunate and illegal habits, which he has a nasty habit of indulging in at company AGMs. It often has to be taken out by the security people. So at least they avoided that unpleasantness this year. I won't go into further details. I'll leave you to use your imaginations. So I've put there for you a couple of links to two documents which ICSA, the Chartered Governance Institute, produced in March, and I think the second one was the supplement was in early April, about AGMs and the impact of COVID-19. Again, they are based on the UK position. You may find them helpful nonetheless if the timing of an AGM is an issue for you. Let's move on to our third topic, trust and reputation. Now, trust in business has taken a knock, particularly since the credit crunch, the outset of the credit crunch in 2007, the collapse of banks, the need to shore up them and some big insurance companies in 2008. Royal Bank of Scotland being one. You've had your own financial crisis in Cyprus, I beg your pardon, why did I say Malta? In Cyprus, you've had your own problems there. And great work has been done, I know, for example, by Bank of Cyprus in the way that it has addressed the problems that came to light and the way it has moved forward and listed on the London Stock Exchange now, I think, comfortably in the FTSE 250. But, anyone from Bank of Cyprus who's participating, you will know better than any of us what the challenge is when it comes to recovering lost reputation and regaining the trust of your shareholders and customers and the public at large. Interestingly, I read in the Financial Times yesterday an article, business suffers from lack of trust in its virus response. Now, the Edelman Trust Barometer. Edelman is a public relations consultancy which has been conducting a survey of public attitudes over the last 20 years. And they did a spring update. They polled 13,000 people over 11 countries. 43% said they believed companies were protecting their employees sufficiently. And only 29% of those polled named chief executives among the list of leaders who had shone during the pandemic. Despite high-profile pledges by business groups to put other stakeholders on an even footing with their investors, only 45% of survey respondents trusted business to put people before profit. Now that, I think, is a worrying outcome. So, in fact, Richard Edelman of that firm said that government seem to trusting government seems to have gone up, I think, by 11 percentage points overall, given the way governments have been handling or been seen to be handling the coronavirus pandemic. Companies are not enjoying the same trust on the part of the public. So, business, it's been tough for business, adjusting to the demands of a wartime economy. But the public's view of business and business leaders remains mixed. Those companies which are seen to support the public fight against COVID-19 while looking after their people, their staff, should command trust. But if you're going to get trust, the basis for trust has got to be seen to be doing the right thing for customers, employees, suppliers, shareholders, and the wider community. Now, a lot of businesses are taking decisions daily, balancing how to keep the show on the road against the safety of a total lockdown. Some businesses have been very quick to turn to government, in other words, the taxpayer, for support without first making sacrifices. For example, offering to trim executive pay. While it has been understandable that central banks and regulators have been pressing banks not to declare dividends, but rather to conserve cash as a bolster, other companies seem to be following suit. Now, one can understand that. We don't want companies to crash because, it's a truism. Cash is king. At the same time, pension funds and pensioners rely on dividends for daily living. So there's a fine judgment there that boards need to take. Similarly, it's a fine judgment sometimes not to use a crisis like this pandemic as an excuse to shuffle away from corporate values or from ESG, that's environmental, social, and governance commitments. I honestly don't believe that in any jurisdiction, shareholders, employees, and other stakeholders will forgive that kind of shuffling away from previous commitments. I think my sense, and I'm not an expert, but from everything I'm reading, everything I'm picking up, I think the public has got quite a deeply held belief that companies need to be shouldering much more responsibility for helping all their stakeholders, but particularly their employees, during this crisis. As the Bishop of Leeds said just over 5 years ago on a news program here on the BBC, reputations are hard won, but easily lost. And if a reputation is damaged, and it can be done in seconds, having been built up over years, then value is going to suffer. And that is not clever. So, as it says there in the title of this slide, trust and a good reputation need to be earned. Trust in business isn't straightforward. We're living in an extraordinary market. Engagement and communication are vital. And people aren't going to be duped. Good communication is absolutely vital. So, and the tone of that communication needs to be thought about too. Just make sure, every communication that you put out, that any business puts out now, needs to be sense checked. What are the booby traps that we've built into this pronouncement, into this announcement? What could this blow up in our faces? Think about all the questions you don't want to be asked when you put out an announcement. Very, very important. Think about the way HR communicates with staff. There might be some unpleasant messages about furloughing staff, redundancies. The way in which those messages are given out is critical. There were some notorious cases a few years ago of companies sacking people by text message, by SMS. That is not the way to retain a decent reputation. Any business that resorts to that kind of that appalling level of communication with staff is asking for trouble. A humane approach has got to be taken. Well, it doesn't have to be, but I would suggest it's the course of wisdom. So to earn trust, good governance, engagement, and accountability have got to be in place. They've got to be evident in order to reassure stakeholders. Decisions need to be evidence-based and not based to ensure that the situation of the owners of the company are preserved and blow everybody else. Continuing to employ staff. I know that the government of Cyprus has put a safety net in place, a lifeboat, as it were, but pay suppliers, service customers as best as possible, continue to employ staff, look after the welfare of staff, especially key workers. I've mentioned IT staff. You know, in the virtual world in which we're having to live these days, in order for business to carry on functioning, the IT people are critical. And then it's good to think about what business can do for the wider community. You know, do you have a production system or a production method that can be utilized for the public good? You know, some companies have turned over their production line to produce hand sanitizer. Is there enough personal protective equipment for medical staff and those working in care homes? We've got our own nasty little scandal brewing in this country about the inadequacies of government and the whole supply chain there. So what can be done to help frontline medical staff and other key workers? They're putting their lives on the line. I know one person in Cyprus whose husband is a doctor who's been, I think, directed by the government to go and abandon his own practice and work in a hospital in Larnaca. You know, some people in the medical profession are being put to serious disadvantage personally and serious risk. It's good for businesses to think about that and how they can be supported. Now's the time for our charitable instincts to come to the fore. And then communication. It needs to be consistent, it's got to be honest, it's got to be respectful. We've seen some appalling examples in the UK. When lockdown was announced, a sportswear company called Sports Direct, now called Fraser Group, it's owned by a former champion squash player called Mike Ashley. He thought he was going to keep his stores open, so in order to equip people with sports clothing to help them stay fit during the lockdown. And he earned for himself a lot of public criticism for what was clearly a naked attempt to profit at the expense of the public at the time of a seriously worrying pandemic. Another chief executive of the pub chain Wetherspoons made some pretty disparaging remarks about continuing to pay bar staff and just wanting to carry on business as usual. He was very soon silenced by a justified outpouring of rage from the public about that pretty heartless and selfish approach that he was taking. So I come back to the point I was making on the previous slide. Think carefully about the tone of the messaging. Think about the human touch. How is this going to come across? Put yourselves in the shoes of the average employee with whom you are communicating. Maybe there's an uncomfortable message to be given. Just word choice, just simple word choice can make the difference between your communication being a complete disaster and a communication which, despite it being perhaps a difficult one for the recipient to absorb, nonetheless is appreciated. So great care needs to be taken in all messaging at a time like this. The public mood is changing. It's quite remarkable, actually, to be witnessing almost an international culture shift. Leave that little one hanging in the air. And now we're in the home straight, and I'm conscious I've got 45 minutes, and I think I've got about 6 or 7 to go. Don't forget the basics. I've listed there 12 points which should not be forgotten, and the pandemic and everything associated with it is not an excuse for ignoring basic points like acting in the company's best interests, obeying the company's constitution, monitoring the financial situation, keep asking about going concern, adequacy of working capital, look after your creditors. Make sure, number 7, that the board keeps proper records of board decisions. If the decision is to take decisions in an email thread or several email threads, someone needs to pull together the essentials of the decision that was reached from those emails and record it as a decision, which is then circulated to the board as a record of that email discussion. Very important. Continue to avoid conflicts of interest and duty. It is quite remarkable in recent times how stupid some senior and well-placed and well-paid people are being about conflicts of interest. I think the latest humdinger involves the Norway's sovereign wealth fund, which actually looks after all its oil wealth. Quite incredible stupidity being displayed, but also with it breathtaking arrogance. Conflicts of interest can bring about the premature termination of good careers. Seek external advice when it's necessary. I mentioned that already in the context of holding annual general meetings, but you need to think too about if the company is facing financial difficulty. It's not a sign of failure to seek advice from a licensed insolvency practitioner. That isn't, hoisting a white flag of surrender. It's actually common sense, because if your company is in financial difficulty, getting an insolvency expert to review the steps you are planning to take is actually a safeguard. Your plan may not work out, but the fact you have taken that advice, and there is a record of you having taken that advice, will be a very good defense if the company has to go into administration or worse, into liquidation. And there are then some difficult questions to answer about the circumstances in which that administration or liquidation came about. So it's not a sign of failure to go to an insolvency practitioner. Sadly, I think we're going to see quite a lot of litigation coming out of COVID-19. If people contract the virus in circumstances where they've gone back to work and physical distancing has not been properly managed, then people are going to cast around in this compensation-driven age and look for someone who's going to pay out compensation. So I think for businesses, directors, important you prepare for that and make sure you've got good records of why you are doing, as you prepare for people to come back to work, make sure you've got a good audit trail showing why certain decisions were taken, what the reasoning was, so that come the inquiry, which could be some years after the problem, complaint, issue, the subject of litigation, when the court case comes on, you can rely on some written down record. And then finally, the directors and officers liability policy. Have you looked at it recently? Do you know what the cover is? Have you got enough cover? Don't forget, this is a policy for the directors and the officers of the company. It's not for anybody else. If you are on the wrong end of a personal liability claim as a director or as an officer of a company, you need this policy. Have you got enough cover? And what are the exclusions? So I'd urge you to take an interest in that if you haven't done before. And then there are safeguards for home working. Now, this is just, if people are working from home, if they're taking a work laptop home, they've got to be strict rules about who may use it and in what circumstances. There are a lot of scams going on at the moment. Train employees to detect and handle phishing attacks. The safeguarding of confidential information, including intellectual property and confidential information about the firm, needs to be safeguarded. They're all common sense stuff there, but I just leave those thoughts with you too. Safeguards for home working are important at this particular time. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think, yes, end of presentation Q&A session. Thank you for your attention. I hope it's been of some help, some interest, and thank you for joining this seminar today.
Yes, now the the participant can send their questions right at the chat box
Can I answer them verbally rather than with my two-finger typing skills?
verbally.
Thank you very
Of course.
much. Thank you. Right, it's a question from Melios about redundancies. What would be my approach to handling redundancies that need to take place? If they need to take place, they've got to take place. I think it is the way in which the decision is reached and the way in which the decision is communicated and the steps which are taken to try to minimize the hurt and worry that will be caused to particular employees. There needs to be a logic to the way you handle redundancies, because again, you don't want to get an employment case coming out of this, in an employment court or tribunal. So I think generally, I think governments are keen to try to keep people working if they can, rather than see the jobless total amount. I mean, you've only got to look at what's happened in the United States. I mean, all right, in terms of scale, Cyprus versus even the UK versus the United States, tiny in comparison. But when you see a jobless total of the kind that the United States has got, what sort of message does that send out? I think it's appalling. So if there is any sort of government lifeboat that you can use first, call on first, do that. But if that won't work and redundancies are needed, then do it as humanely as you can, but watch what you put in writing, because it may come back to bite you if you don't take care.
Some reason which person to ask. Can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Nice to hear you.
I'm fine. Thank you for the nice presentation. And I was trying to speak before, but there were so many buttons, so I didn't know how to make them on. Sorry. I wish to ask you to give a few comments on the role of the secretary in this situation. Is this most of the role of supporting the chair of arranging the meetings, or it can give some extra value?
Oh, I think the role of the secretary, in particular at a time where you're holding virtual board meetings, virtual committee meetings, I think the secretary's role is vital. And we come back to that point I made earlier on about preparation. You need to think through all the essentials. Something actually I didn't mention, Anastasia, which you and other colleagues might like to bear in mind. Another alternative is for the board to have a meeting, or to approve a written resolution appointing, for example, a general purposes committee, which could be the chairman, the chief executive, the finance director, and one other, and giving them delegated authority to manage most of the affairs of the company up within certain financial limits or other constraints. Because if there's a duly authorized committee that can effectively stand in the shoes of the board during a period of lockdown, that may make working life a lot easier. The pressure for the company secretary is to make sure that those minutes are properly, that those meetings are properly convened, are properly minuted, and that the minutes are prepared very quickly and circulated promptly as drafts to all the members of the board for their comments. And that the corporate secretary's role then as a lead communicator with the members of the board is going to be absolutely vital. You do not want mushroom syndrome, directors being kept in the dark. Very, very important to keep them all on side. If you go for virtual meetings, I think if you'll have these slides. I've set out what I think are some essential points there. Prepare, prepare, prepare. And in order to make sure the meeting, your virtual meetings are successful. There's another question here about the role of the secretary preparing minutes. Do I favour short minutes where mainly the decisions of the board are recorded, or long minutes where the position of each board member is recorded in detail? I prefer the former. I think short minutes are to be preferred. There is a saying, surplus words go septic. It's much better to have a brief summary of what each proposal is about, and then to record the significant points that are made without mentioning individual directors, and then to record the decision that's reached. There's also a question there about recording board meetings. I think generally, I don't think it's a good idea at all. I think it's a very bad idea, unless the company secretary is away and you've got a deputy or somebody else who's standing in who's not so familiar with the board. I think in that situation, a recording may be helpful, but don't forget you get absolutely everything. Usually I used to find with a board meeting that less tends to be more, and where I really hadn't followed the discussion, I used to work on the basis, if in doubt, leave it out. And I was never, ever challenged on the draft minutes I produced when I left out great chunks of stuff that I couldn't understand. I worked on the basis, if I can't understand it, I don't think the board are going to make much fuss if it isn't mentioned in the board minutes. Bit arrogant, but I got away with it. Now we've got another comment here. We've had a few virtual meetings so far during this period and been very successful. Good. That's really encouraging. Glad about that. I hope I may have given you one or 2 points to think about for your meetings, but that's really encouraging. I think the only point I would make about these meetings is you've got to keep an eye on the quorum. That is important. But that's good news that they've worked well. Pleased about that. Excellent. Did I give enough of an answer on the question about, since board meetings are held virtually, do you think it'd be a good idea to record them? I think on balance, probably it's Marios who asked that question. I think on balance, it's probably the course of wisdom to record them. But I come back to the point I made earlier. Make sure that recording is deleted when the minutes of that board meeting are approved at the next meeting of the board. I don't hang on to recordings, and certainly not if you're in a regulated industry and the regulator wants to get their hands on the recording. Not a good idea. Okay, how are we doing?
All right.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Just to close the presentation, thank you, Mr. Osborne, for the very interesting information you have provided to us. Dear participants, we have now come to an end of this presentation. The video of the presentation will soon be publicly available on the InfoCredits Group website and on our company's social media channels. A certificate of attendance will be sent to your email address. We hope we have met your expectations and that you have found this webinar interesting. Please take some time to provide us with feedback about today's sessions on the survey link that is on the chat box and will be sent to you also on your email address. Thank you once again. Have a nice rest of the day.
Okay, and bye from me.